Hi guys, I'm Sarah, and welcome to episode 4 of my barn quilt project, the series where I recreate quilt blocks that I see on barns. I found this week's block on the side of our family farm in Innisfil. This farm used to offer a pick-your-own strawberry field, and I remember going there to pick strawberries as a child. But unfortunately, the pick-your-own is no longer in operation. They do, however, still have this beautiful strawberry quilt block on the side of their barn, and I really love that they leaned into the strawberry farm theme. This block is gorgeous, but also is quite complicated, with a lot of components, so this is going to be a longer video. So get some snacks, get comfy, and strap in for the ride, because it was a bumpy one. I don't know what gave me the confidence to take on something so difficult so soon in my quilting journey. I guess I was just blinded by the beauty and jumped right in. I drew the block out and decided to break it down into several smaller components to make it a more manageable project for my skill level. These components will be the flowers in the corners, the outer border between the flowers, the white strips with the red corners to the sides of the strawberry, the main body of the strawberry, and the stem at the top. I'm starting with the flowers, and for this I needed white, red, and yellow fabric. I got the yellow fabric in a mixed bag of quilting fabric from the thrift store recently. I used an eyelet for the white because I love eyelet, and this fabric was actually the skirt off of a stool that used to be in my bedroom. The red is leftover fabric from a dress my mom made me for my university graduation. So for each flower, I cut out 1 1¼ inch square of the yellow, 3 1¼ inch squares of the red, 1 3-inch square of the red, 1 3-inch square of the white, and 1 2-inch square of the white. I started by taking the 3-inch red square and the 3-inch white square and pinning them right sides together. I then drew a guideline up the middle diagonally that I will use for sewing. Then I took the 4 1¼ inch squares and arranged them in the order they will appear in the finished block. I pinned together the top row and the bottom row and brought them over to the sewing machine. I sewed a 1/4 inch from either side of the guideline I had drawn on the 3-inch squares, and then cut down the line to create 2 half-square triangles. And for the 1 1/4 inch squares, I just sewed with a basic 1/4 inch seam allowance. Once the pieces were pressed open, I had to trim down my half-square triangles to 2 inches before moving on to the next step. I laid out my pieces in the order they will appear in the finished block, and started by pinning together the 2 pairs of 1 1/4 inch squares that I sewed in the previous step. I made sure to nest the seams together and then sewed them together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I added that back into my laid out design and pinned together the top 2 squares and the bottom 2 squares. Once everything was pinned and ready to go, I took the squares over to the sewing machine and sewed them up with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then I gave each of them a good press, pressing the seams on each piece towards the half-square triangle to ensure that the seams will nest in the next step. Now it's time to prepare the final sewing step for the flowers. I pinned together my 2 final pieces, making sure to double-check that they are in the correct orientation and my seams are nested, before bringing it over to the sewing machine to sew up that final seam with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Once the flower was fully sewn up, I brought it over to the ironing board and gave it a final press to get the whole thing laying flat. I completed all the steps for the flower 3 more times, and the corners of my block were done. The next component I decided to sew was the border pieces, and for this I needed yellow, red, and green fabric. I cut out 1 3-inch square of the green, 1 3-inch square of the red, and 2 3-inch squares of the yellow. I pinned 1 yellow square right sides together with the red square, and the other yellow square right sides together with the green square, and for each, drew a guideline diagonally across the square. I sewed a 1/4 inch from either side of the guideline that I drew, and then cut down the line, dividing each pinned square into 2 half-square triangles. Once they were all sewn and cut, I gave them a press and trimmed each half-square triangle down to 2 inches. You do not need to make your half square triangles as big as I do, and you could instead start with 2 3/8 inch squares. I just prefer to make mine a little big and then trim them to size. With all my pieces ready to go, I laid out the half square triangles in the pattern they will appear in the final block, and pinned all of the pieces right sides together to be sewn. This border was entirely made up of half square triangles, so it was fairly easy to sew up. I sewed up each seam with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and then gave it a final press, and that's all there was to it. I repeated the process 3 more times, and the border was complete. I laid them out with the corners, and so far the block is looking pretty good. The next component I decided to tackle was the strips to either side of the strawberry, and for this I needed the white fabric and the red fabric. I cut out a 3-inch square of the red, a 3-inch square of the white, and a 3.5-inch by 2-inch rectangle of the white. I pinned the 2 squares right sides together and proceeded to sew them into half square triangles in the same manner as all the previous ones, and then pressed and trimmed them down to 2 inches. I was then able to lay all of the pieces out into their proper order and pin them up, making sure that the red triangles were in the correct position. I sewed all of the pieces together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and the third component of my block was done. All it needed was a little press. I repeated the process for the other side of the strawberry and added the pieces to my block layout. I decided that next, before moving on to the strawberry in the middle, I would sew up the side pieces. I started this by pinning together the piece we just finished with the outer border piece, taking extra care to match up my corners. Once it was pinned, I took it over to the sewing machine and sewed up the seam with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. You could always wait to do this step until the end when all of your components are ready for assembly, but I did it now, mostly because I was avoiding doing the math for cutting the strawberry pieces, but you'll hear more about that later. Anyways, once that piece was sewn and pressed, I pinned the 2 flower pieces to either end, again nesting my seams and making sure the corners are positioned correctly. Once it was all pinned, I once again brought it over to the sewing machine and sewed it up with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Sewing up these sides and being able to see a portion of my block finished really gave me a sense of accomplishment and pushed me to keep going and tackle the hard part that is the strawberry. I gave my piece a press and repeated the entire process to the other side of the block, so that only the 2 middle border pieces were left unattached. I laid out everything I had finished and then began the strawberry. I started by making a template for the strawberry out of a piece of cardstock, since it is a more irregular shape and would be incredibly difficult to cut out accurately freehand. I also cut out 2 right-angled triangles out of the white, with a height of 3 1/4 inches and a base of 2 3/4 inches. I did this by cutting a rectangle measuring 3 1/4 inches by 2 3/4 inches, and then cutting that in half diagonally. Also, I cut a white rectangle measuring 6.5 inches by 1.5 inches. I pinned the triangles to the bottom angled edges of the strawberry. I tried my best to ensure that there was equal overhang of the white triangle on either side of the strawberry edge. This will ensure that after sewing, the corners will be properly squared. I sewed my seams with a 1/4 inch seam allowance and then pressed the piece to make sure everything was laying flat. You'll notice when I press this, things are not lining up the way they should. This is because I used the wrong measurements the first time, but I sewed it again with the correct measurements that I gave in this video, and it worked. I pinned the long white rectangle onto the bottom edge and sewed that up with a 1/4 inch seam allowance and gave it a press. Next, I needed to add on the red corners to match with the half square triangles on the sides I sewed previously. So to do this, I cut out 2 2-inch squares from the red and pinned 1 on each corner. I drew a guideline diagonally down the middle of each square and then took it over to the sewing machine and stitched straight down that guideline. Once the squares were sewn on, I trimmed off the excess fabric, the side of the stitch line with only the corner and not the strawberry, and folded the red corner out. I pressed those corners flat, and that finished up the bottom of the strawberry, with only a little bit of a hiccup. Now it's onto the first set of leaves at the top, and this is where I really struggled. I sewed and picked out so many times that I just stopped recording. So please enjoy this footage of me struggling while I tell you the not-so-professional way that I sewed this together. So basically what I did was sew 2 half-square triangles from green and white and trimmed the top and sides down to 2 inches while leaving the bottom untrimmed. I then tacked on a scrap of green to the green side of my half-square triangles to make it wider, and then marked where I wanted the red corners to land and sewed those sides on. Then, across the top of the strawberry, I added a strip of green to close the gap. Was that the proper way to do it? No. But does it look like a strawberry? Yes. So I don't care. Anyways, so moving on from that mess, I started the final component, which is the stem at the top of the strawberry. For this, I cut out a 3-inch square of the red, a 3-inch square of the white, a 3.5-inch by 1-inch rectangle of the white, a 2.25-inch square of the white, a 2.25-inch square of the green, and a 1.5-inch square of the green. First, I pinned my 3-inch squares right sides together and my 2.25-inch squares right sides together. I drew a guideline diagonally down the middle of each and then sewed on either side of that line to create my half-square triangles. I pressed those all open and then trimmed the red and white squares down to 2 inches and the green and white squares down to 1.5 inches. I laid out my design and pinned together my 3 1.5-inch squares, ensuring that they are in the proper order. Once those were all pinned, I brought them over to the sewing machine and sewed up those seams with a 1/4-inch seam allowance and gave it a good press. I brought it back over to the mat and pinned the white rectangle to the top of the rectangle formed by those 3 squares. I again sewed it up with a 1/4-inch seam allowance and pressed everything flat. Now, to finish it up, all I had to do was attach the half-square triangles. I pinned them on, making sure they are in the correct orientation, and sewed them each on with a 1/4-inch seam allowance. Once that last seam was sewn, my final block component was complete, and all I had to do was give it a press. Now, the hard part was done, and I laid out all of my hard work. I always love getting this first look at what the block is going to look like when it's finally done. I started assembling the middle section of the block by pinning the strawberry to the bottom border and the stem piece to the top border. There were a lot of seams to match, so I took care to pin each one in place before sewing my pieces together. I sewed up those seams with a 1/4-inch seam allowance, and I will tell you, some of those seams are getting thick. Once those pieces were sewn and pressed, I pinned them together to sew up that last seam of the middle section. The red body of the strawberry takes up much of the middle section of this block, and is actually the reason that I chose to use a solid fabric for the red rather than a print, to prevent it from being too busy of a block. With all the seams of the middle section sewn, I only had to give it a press, and then it is finally on to the final step. I pinned the sides onto the middle, matching up the corners that needed to meet, which ended up only being the red triangles bordering the strawberry, so it wasn't too bad. I sewed up those seams with a 1/4-inch seam allowance, and let me tell you, I was glad to be done. This block was a challenge, and at times incredibly frustrating, but I'm glad I did it. It didn't turn out perfect, and you could probably point out a million things wrong with it. The corners don't all meet, the larger leaves don't come to points, the edges are uneven. But despite all that, you can definitely look at this block and look at the barn quilt I based it off of and know that they are the same block. And that is the point of this project after all. So I am happy and ready for the next challenge that the barn quilts throw my way. Many of these barn quilts were, after all, made simply as art, with no intention for them to actually be made into real quilts. So I'm sure there will be more interesting piecing to come. After its final press and a little trim to get those edges even, this is my finished Strawberry Fields block. I hope you like it, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. As your little teaser, let's just say it will have some questionable color choices. See you then, and happy quilting.